The silence that shouldn't have been. It didn't happen all at once. The world didn't crumble in a single day. Cities didn't burst into flames like dry parchment touched by a candle. The old kingdoms didn't wake up one morning to find their gates broken and their gods abandoned. No, it was slower than that. Stranger. More haunting. The Bronze Age, a time of kings and scribes, of ships heavy with copper and palaces carved from sunlight, began to flicker like a dying torch. Somewhere between memory and myth, the great cities started to go quiet. Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae. Forgotten not because they were never great, but because someone wanted them forgotten. For a long time, no one noticed. Traders chalked up delays to bad weather. Scribes blamed omens. Priests pointed at stars. But the ships stopped coming. The letters stopped arriving. And the gods? They stopped answering. Across the eastern Mediterranean, something was unraveling. What survived wasn't the cities or the laws or the armies. It was a letter. A single clay tablet, barely saved from fire, its edges scorched, its words hurried. A desperate cry from the last king of Ugarit to the king of Al-Ashir. My enemies are attacking my city. My troops are away. Save us. No reply ever came. Because Al-Ashir, modern Cyprus, was also burning. But here's what no one tells you. The collapse wasn't inevitable. It wasn't nature. It wasn't famine or earthquake or the wrath of distant gods. It was designed. Somebody wanted the world to fall apart, and someone made sure no one remembered who. The story begins long before the fires, long before the palaces cracked and the languages disappeared. It begins with a whisper. A strange movement across the seas, unfamiliar sails on the horizon, men who spoke no known tongue, raiders who didn't just loot, they erased. They didn't just kill kings, they erased their names. They were never me, and to be remembered. That was the point. But the ancients did try. They scratched warnings into temple walls. They carved their fears into stone. One name kept appearing. The Sea Peoples. No one knows exactly who they were. No one knows where they came from. But the terror they left behind spread like blood in water. Egypt barely survived them. Ramses III himself had to raise entire fleets to hold them back. And even then, the land bled. But here's where it gets even stranger. After the Sea Peoples came, entire writing systems vanished. Entire economies collapsed. The world became silent. Clay tablets stopped appearing. Palaces were left half-burned, as if someone had been interrupted mid-ritual, mid-meal, mid-prayer. The bones we've found are buried hastily, often with signs of trauma. Mass graves, burned temples, abandoned harbors where goods still lie packed for voyages that never happened. This wasn't nature. This wasn't just war. This was targeted. Someone, or some group, dismantled the networks that held the ancient world together. Trade routes collapsed not just because of pirates or war, but because someone wanted those routes severed. Cities fell not randomly, but strategically. Coastal centers first, then inland capitals, then the records themselves. And what's most chilling, it worked. For over 300 years, civilization forgot how to read, how to write, how to build ships or fortresses. The Mediterranean world dimmed, like someone had thrown a cloth over the sun. They called it a dark age. But it wasn't dark because of ignorance. It was dark because someone turned off the lights. And no one's quite sure who had the power or the reason to do that. But there are signs. Patterns that archaeologists and historians used to overlook. Unmarked ships in ancient drawings. Weapons that don't match local metallurgy. Burial styles that don't belong. The attackers we poked at. weren't just outsiders, they were organized. And maybe they weren't just warriors. Maybe they were something else. Agents of disruption, saboteurs of an old order. Maybe they weren't destroying the world out of rage. Maybe they were making room for something new. But before that could happen, everything old had to die. The palaces, the priesthoods, the scribes, the gods. They had to go. And so they did. What remained were ashes and puzzles. Who gains from a world reset? Who profits when all systems crash? Who steps in when power is suddenly vacant? Sometimes the best way to hide a crime is to erase all the witnesses. And the Bronze Age had a lot of witnesses. But one or two voices made it through, not loud enough to stop the collapse, but just enough to leave questions. That clay tablet from Ugarit, for example. The desperate cry of a king under siege. The panic in his words. The way he says, "My ships are out at sea." Almost like he never expected the attack to come from land. Almost like he trusted the sea. And that was the mistake. Because the sea was no longer a friend, it had been turned into a weapon. And the ones who wielded it didn't speak your language, didn't honor your gods, didn't need your gold. They came for silence. And silence is exactly what they left behind. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes, not from the great halls of kings, but from the cracks in burned walls, from the scorched corners of tablets, from the buried bones of merchants, sailors, and scribes. They're still whispering, still waiting to be heard, still telling us that what happened wasn't a collapse. It was a cover-up. And now, the truth is beginning to surface. The web. They tried to untangle. There's a myth we like to believe, that ancient civilizations lived in isolation, that kingdoms were sealed off behind stone walls, each a separate little world. But that's not what the Bronze Age looked like. Not at all. It was a web. From the palaces of Crete to the fields of Anatolia, from the deserts of Egypt to the rocky coasts of Greece, the world was tied together. Copper from Cyprus, tin from the east, gold from Nubia, grain from the Nile, cedar from Lebanon, lapis from far beyond the horizon. And everywhere, letters, clay tablets, sealed scrolls, messages between kings, laced with flattery and threats, exchanged like precious gifts. They called each other brother, because they knew something we've forgotten. They needed each other to survive. So what happens when that web is cut? Not just frayed, but severed, silently, swiftly, intentionally. What happens when a merchant's route suddenly isn't safe? When ships disappear without a trace? When a harvest rots in the fields because the promised oxen never arrive? Collapse doesn't begin with explosions. It begins with silence. And the silence spread fast. It began in the north. Hattusa, capital of the mighty Hittites, a kingdom carved from stone and storm, vanished almost overnight. No dramatic final battle, no records of a siege, just silence. A royal archive buried beneath rubble, palaces scorched, statues toppled. No farewell, just stillness. To the west, Mycenae, once the home of legendary kings, turned inward. Its palaces grew paranoid, walls thickened, storerooms filled with weapons instead of grain. Something was coming, and they could feel it, but they couldn't stop it. To the south, Ugarit, a jewel of trade and letters, cried out. Its last king wrote, "Behold, the enemy's ships have come. My cities are burning with fire, and they have done evil things in my country. No help. You just need to pull out the right threads. And whoever did this, They knew exactly where to pull. There's a theory no one likes to talk about. That it wasn't just invaders, that some of the rot came from within. What if the sea peoples weren't strangers, but exiles? What if they were mercenaries, cast off by the very kings they once served? Refugees from failed alliances, survivors of dynasties devoured by greed and betrayal? What if they weren't just looters, but witnesses? People who saw how fragile the world really was and decided to break it. Not for gold, not for revenge, but because they believed something else should take its place. If that's true, then the collapse wasn't chaos. It was a reset. And that makes it even more terrifying. Because planned destruction is harder to stop than random disaster. It means someone was thinking ahead. Someone wanted the old world gone. Its kings, its contracts, its codes. And once the smoke cleared, nothing was left to rebuild from. No blueprints, no alliances, just memory. And memory fades fast when there's no one left to speak it. But deep in the ruins, some memories remain. A charred scroll buried beneath a collapsed archive. A shattered mural behind temple rubble. A child's grave, clutching a foreign amulet. Little things, but they speak. Not loudly, not clearly, but they whisper the same thing over and over. This didn't just happen. Someone made it happen, and someone made sure we'd forget. But we didn't. Not completely. Because here we are, digging through ashes, rebuilding the web, thread by thread, word by word. And with each piece we find, the story grows clearer. The collapse wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. And the truth is still buried somewhere beneath the silence. The cities that shouldn't have fallen. Some cities die slowly. They crumble over centuries, fading like old songs no one sings anymore. But others fall all at once, like the gods themselves turned away in a single breath. That's what happened to Hattusa. Once, it was the heart of the Hittite Empire, a city carved into the Anatolian stone, guarded by lions and storm gods, its gates rising like the mouths of giants. Inside, the great king ruled with tablets and treaties. His scribes etched secrets into clay, stacking them in archives that smelled of earth and power. And then one day, it was gone. Not faded, not weakened. Gone. No slow decline, no final stand. Just fire, broken walls, and silence. The archives lay cracked and scorched. Thousands of clay tablets, still speaking across the centuries, until the flames devoured the last sentence. No sign of who lit them. No names, no battle cries, no grand armies parading in victory. Just absence. Like someone had walked in, removed the heart of an empire, and vanished into smoke. And Hattusa wasn't alone. Down the coast, Ugarit burned too. But Ugarit left us something. Those final, desperate letters. Pleas to allies who were already falling. Notes from merchants begging for safe passage. And one eerie tablet, found still resting in its kiln, unbaked, because the scribe never returned to fire it. It reads like this: "The enemy is near. They have set fire to the cities. May the gods watch over us." But the gods didn't watch. Or maybe they did, and chose to look away. That's the part no one wants to admit. That maybe the gods of the old world were failing. Or worse, were being replaced. Because the collapse didn't just destroy cities. It ended belief systems. It severed the ties between heaven and earth. The temples fell quiet. The offerings ceased. The divine bloodlines that once ruled as gods among mortals were either dead or hiding, and that left a vacuum. The kind of silence that doesn't just echo, it invites something else to fill it. But before the dust even settled, someone was already rewriting the story. New rulers rose in the ruins. They didn't speak the old tongues. They didn't pray to the same stars. They built differently, traded differently, fought differently. And most of all, they remembered nothing, or at least they claimed they didn't. That's the hardest part to swallow. That there was a generation, maybe two, maybe more, who lived through the end of everything and said nothing. No chronicles, no lamentations, no monuments to what was lost, only silence. Which begs the question, were they silenced, or were they complicit? Maybe some of them didn't want to remember the old world. Maybe the new one suited them better. Because in the vacuum of collapsed trade routes and fallen empires, power shifted. Suddenly, small coastal villages became centers of survival. Smaller warlords, once ignored by kings, now ruled what was left. It was a new kind of world. Messier, louder, but freer. Freer if you had nothing left to lose. And that's where the survivors come in. The ones history forgot. Fishermen who watched ships burn on the horizon. Farmers who returned to find their fields salted. Children who grew up never knowing palaces, only ashes. Their stories were never written down, but they carried something else. Memory. Raw, unfiltered, and sometimes dangerously honest. They spoke of tall ships with curved prows, of warriors with strange armor whose eyes gleamed in the firelight, of priests who fled with sacred relics strapped to their backs, of entire families walking into the woods and never returning. And they whispered one name again and again. Not in reverence, not in fear, but in warning. The ones from the sea. They didn't come to conquer. They came to wipe clean. And if you look closely, they didn't come alone. There were signs of coordination. Inland revolts that erupted just as the coasts were attacked. Trade records that stopped all at once across multiple kingdoms. Symbols scratched into stone in different lands. Matching, but not native. Like a shared signal or an agreement. This wasn't one group. It was a network. Loose, maybe, but real. People who hated the old order. People who had waited for a weakness and found it. And when they struck, they didn't just break walls. They broke memory. Because memory is the real threat. You can burn a palace, but if someone remembers what it stood for, it can be rebuilt. But if no one remembers, then it never existed. And that, more than anything, was the goal. Erase the world and start over. Not everyone agreed, of course. Some fought back. Some tried to hide the old ways, burying tablets, hiding sacred texts, carving messages into cliff faces no one thought to check. And slowly those hidden voices are starting to return. We're finding them now. A temple buried under a city's second layer, sealed tight with clay and fear. A secret cache of scrolls in a tomb once thought empty. A merchant's ring, etched with the name of a city no map recalls. These things whisper. They tell us that the fall wasn't blind chaos. It was surgical. And those who survived it weren't just lucky. They were chosen. Or perhaps they chose themselves. And their silence was never fear. It was strategy. Because they knew something, we're only now beginning to understand. The real story of the Bronze Age collapse isn't about what fell. It's about who made it fall, and why they still don't want us to know. The ghost ships of the ancient sea. They didn't look like conquerors. Not at first. The drawings show them with horned helmets and feathered crests, standing tall in ships carved like animals. Strange clothes, stranger weapons, no known language, no visible flag. And yet, everywhere they landed, the world ended. They didn't build cities. They didn't plant crops. They didn't write poems or erect statues in their own honor. They erased, and then they vanished. We call them the Sea Peoples, but that's not what they called themselves. No one really knows what they called themselves. And maybe that's the most terrifying part, because anonymity is a weapon too, and they wielded it with perfection. But if you follow the clues, they weren't just pirates, drifting on waves of chaos. They moved with eerie coordination. They struck at dusk. They waited for garrisons to leave. They timed their landings with uprisings inland, like someone had whispered secrets into the ears of rebels. And they didn't just strike one place. They hit everywhere. Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, Crete, Greece. Cities burned almost in unison, like the world was being reset in chapters, page by page, fire by fire. Too synchronized to be coincidence, too widespread to be local, and too effective to be unplanned. So who were they? Some say they were displaced peoples, refugees from collapsing regions, driven to violence by hunger and fear. Others believe they were mercenaries, trained by the very empires they destroyed. Former allies, now turned enemies. But there's a third idea, a darker one, that they were created. Not born of one nation or tribe, but assembled. Pieces of many peoples, drawn together by a common purpose. Maybe even funded, armed, directed. Not just vandals, but instruments. Someone's instruments. But whose? Because if there was a mastermind, their fingerprints are gone, scrubbed clean. No leaders are left standing. No empire that emerged victorious. Just silence. Still, there are details that don't fit the refugee theory. For people fleeing disaster, the Sea Peoples had a lot of weapons, well made, uniform in style. For people who came from nowhere, they knew exactly where to hit. Strategic locations, palace granaries, trade ports, temples holding archives. They didn't steal gold, they burned knowledge. That's what makes them different. That's what makes them terrifying. Because if you're hungry, you steal food. If you're desperate, you take shelter. But if you burn every book, every tablet, every memory, you're not trying to survive. You're trying to erase. And they nearly did. They left no written language, no known descendants, no preserved myths, just fragments, Egyptian murals, desperate letters from dying kings, scattered weapons buried in cities that should have never fallen. The last known battle with them took place in Egypt, under Ramses III. He met them at the Nile Delta. They came in ships shaped like beasts. Ramses carved the battle into temple walls, his fleet clashing with theirs, arrows darkening the sky. He claimed victory, and maybe he did win. But it didn't matter, because by then, the damage was already done. The rest of the world had already fallen, and Egypt was bleeding. Even Ramses couldn't stop the unraveling. The state grew weaker. Corruption seeped in, tombs were robbed, grain supplies vanished, and within a generation, even mighty Egypt was a shadow of its former self. The Sea Peoples didn't need to rule. They just needed to disrupt. Like saboteurs, sent ahead of a storm. And after the storm came the quiet. The ancient world, the one built on shared memory, trade, and divine kingship, was gone. The web was cut. The lights were dimmed, and a strange amnesia settled over the land. Generations passed, living in the ruins of things they couldn't name. People carved stones from the blocks of old temples, not knowing who the gods had been. Farmers ploughed over palaces. Shepherds camped beside crumbling aqueducts. The knowledge was gone, except for a few hidden places, a buried chamber beneath a collapsed fortress, a scorched tablet found beneath a grain silo. A single mural, sealed behind stone, showing unfamiliar ships on a burning sea. The whispers are coming back, and they're all saying the same thing. This wasn't nature. It wasn't accident. It was intention. And the sea peoples. They were just the beginning. Someone had a plan. And that plan didn't end with destruction. It ended with forgetting. But not all memory dies. Some waits in the dust. And dust, if disturbed, begins to speak. The places that remember nothing. You can tell a lot from ruins. Most speak in their own way. A collapsed temple whispers of lost rituals. A broken wall hums with the memory of arrows. A burnt scroll still curls like a dying breath. Even in silence, ruins carry echoes. But some places remember nothing. Not because nothing happened, but because someone didn't want anything left to remember. There are cities we've found that shouldn't exist, buried deep beneath others. Cities with no name, no writing, no clues to who lived there. Just the outline of rooms, hearths still stained with soot, doorways carefully blocked, as if the people left and didn't want to be followed. In one such site, somewhere between the old Hittite lands and the rising hills of Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered a series of homes deliberately collapsed. Not burned, not looted. Just buried. Perfectly. Quietly. As though the inhabitants decided to erase themselves. Why? Why would an entire community choose silence? They didn't flee. They didn't leave signs of panic. It was as if they packed their lives away and sealed the lid on their own story. And that's not the only one. There are burial grounds with bones rearranged. Skulls with foreign markings, tattoos in patterns never seen before. Children buried clutching idols of gods unknown to that region. Traders, perhaps? Refugees? Or remnants of something more organized? Something designed to scatter and to blend. It's the same pattern. Disappear. Don't draw attention. Erase what came before. But in some places, they failed. In the Levant, near the ruins of Lachish, archaeologists found a strange layer of destruction. A perfect burn line. Entire buildings collapsed inward. A thick coating of ash. But no valuables taken. No bodies left behind. And inside the ash, a single symbol carved into a piece of ivory. It doesn't match any known script. It's not Sumerian, not Akkadian, not Hittite, not even Egyptian. It appears once, then never again, like a signature or a warning. We don't know what it means, but someone wanted it buried in fire, and someone didn't want it spoken again. These are the gaps in history we were never meant to see. Clean, precise, empty. But silence can be suspicious, especially when it's this neat, especially when it happens everywhere, at the same time. The palaces of Mycenae collapsed, their walls scorched black, but only certain rooms were burned. The ones with records, the ones with ledgers, letters, diplomatic tablets. Storage rooms were untouched. It's not the pattern of a riot. It's the pattern of a purge. Selective. Targeted. Like someone went room by room, deciding what would survive and what wouldn't. And now, centuries later, we're digging through the ashes, trying to stitch together a story from what was deliberately left behind. But there's another problem. Sometimes, what's left behind isn't ancient. Sometimes, it's modern. Because for years, certain artifacts disappeared from museum inventories. Entire crates labeled unclassified bronze material sent to labs, never catalogued. Private collections holding tablets that were once state property, shipwrecks discovered, then quietly buried again by bulldozers. Why? Because sometimes the past isn't just forgotten. Sometimes it's hidden, on purpose. Because the truth doesn't serve the story. And the story we've been told? It's tidy. Empires rose. Empires fell. The people moved on. But the ruins argue otherwise. They tell us something darker. That the collapse wasn't a fall. It was a reset. That it didn't come from weakness, but from design. And that those who caused it didn't vanish. They just changed their name, or gave up names altogether. The sea peoples, the migrants, the invaders, all terms invented by the survivors, by the ones writing history, after the fact. But what if those survivors weren't innocent? What if they weren't victims? What if they were the second wave? The ones who came in the quiet, to inherit the silence. Because when the lights go out on an age, someone is always standing in the dark, waiting to light the first torch of the new one. The only question is, who were they? And what did they want us to forget? The survivors who remembered too much. Not everyone burned. Not every city fell. Not every voice went silent. In the shadows of the collapse, a few places endured, not untouched, but unbroken. They didn't rise in defiance or meet the invaders in open battle. Instead, they did something far more dangerous. They remembered. They carried memory like smuggled gold, hidden, precious, forbidden. In the highlands of Canaan, small communities began to form. They didn't build palaces. They didn't carve statues. But they remembered the old ways, not in temples or archives, but in songs, stories, and stone tools passed hand to hand. And in Egypt, though battered and bleeding, the scribes of Ramses III kept writing. They etched the story of the sea peoples into stone, not to glorify the victory, but to warn the future. They came from the sea, the inscriptions read, a force unknown, their origins lost. Egypt had faced them, and barely survived. But even survival had a cost. The old bureaucracies began to rot. Grain deliveries failed. Soldiers deserted. Priests argued over diminishing offerings. Tombs were robbed by men once sworn to protect them. A kingdom still standing, but only just. In Ugarit's ruins, archaeologists discovered something even stranger. A small makeshift structure, built long after the city had fallen. Inside it, fragments of older clay tablets, carefully collected, reassembled, and stored. Someone came back. Someone gathered the broken records. Someone tried to remember. It wasn't official. It wasn't royal. It was personal. Maybe a former scribe. Maybe a child who watched his city burn. Someone who couldn't bear to let the memory die. And across the sea, in parts of Italy, strange pottery began to appear. Not local, not traditional. Styles from across the Aegean, from Anatolia, from the Levant. It wasn't trade. It was movement. Survivors migrating, carrying fragments. Ents of collapsed civilizations on their backs. And with them, knowledge. Small things. How to fire a kiln. How to track the stars. How to forge tools from bronze, even when the copper stopped flowing. Because not everyone forgot. Some remembered in whispers, in symbols carved under wooden floorboards, in stories told by candlelight, in lullabies that once praised kings, now sung as nursery rhymes with the names removed. Memory survived where power didn't. But that made it dangerous. Because in a world rebuilt from ashes, memory is rebellion. The new rulers, whoever they were, had no interest in the old world rising again. They wanted it buried. And they watched carefully for the ones who remembered too well. There are tales, half historical, half mythical, of travelers punished for speaking dead names, of teachers hanged for showing children how to read the old scripts, of villagers who drew maps in the sand, maps to cities no longer on any record, and were never seen again. Control didn't end with fire. It continued with silence. But some silences cracked. In a hidden cave near the Mediterranean coast, archaeologists found a mural, not in any known artistic style. A woman seated between two lions, her hands raised, not in worship, but in warning. Behind her, the sea rises. Ships burn. People run. But her eyes look straight out of the wall, as if she's watching us. She doesn't belong to any pantheon. Her face appears nowhere else. And yet, she's remembered. Passed down in obscure village rituals, in fertility dances and storm prayers. A goddess with no name, or maybe a memory given form. A protector of memory itself. Some think she represents those who tried to keep the old knowledge alive. Others think she's something darker, an echo of what was lost, too powerful to fully forget. Either way, she tells us something important. That not all of history is buried in the ground. Some of it lives on in people, in habits, in fear, in guilt, and most of all, in the stories we were told not to tell. The survivors didn't always speak, but they remembered. And sometimes they remembered too much, enough to draw attention, enough to make them disappear all over again, but not forever. Because now we're listening. Now we're piecing it together. Bit by bit, ash by ash, whisper by whisper. The old world didn't just fall, it was taken down. And the few who lived through it, those who carried its memory forward, they weren't just survivors. They were witnesses. And some of them are still speaking. If you know where to look, the day writing died. It was the quietest apocalypse. No screams, no flames licking the sky, no final battle etched into the stone of memory. Just the steady fading of words. One moment the world was filled with voices, scribes pressing styluses into wet clay, priests chanting in forgotten tongues, merchants scribbling records of trade routes and taxes, and promises made beneath the gaze of gods. And then, one by one, the voices stopped. Writing didn't die in one place. It died everywhere. In Greece, Linear B disappeared. No one wrote it again for centuries. In Anatolia, the Hittite scripts went dark. In Syria, the cuneiform letters stopped. Even the great scribal schools of Mesopotamia grew silent. It was like a curtain dropped across the map, an ancient blackout. The world, once so loud with ink and clay, fell mute. But here's the strangest part. The people didn't disappear. They kept living. They built houses. They farmed. They fought. They buried their dead. But they stopped writing. Not all at once, but fast enough to feel like something more than coincidence. It was as if writing itself had become dangerous, or forbidden, or simply not worth the risk. Because writing is memory. And memory, after a collapse, is power. If you know what came before, you can ask questions, you can challenge, you can rebuild. But if the past is erased, if the words that explain the world are gone, then whoever speaks first, after the silence, gets to invent everything. Maybe that's why the New World rose illiterate, by design. Because if there's no past, there's no accountability. No one can say, this isn't how it was. No one can remember what was stolen. The stories we tell ourselves about the so-called Dark Ages after the collapse often focus on simplicity, on people forgetting how to build, how to write, how to rule. But what if forgetting wasn't the cause? What if it was the G? All? Because in the ruins of Ugarit, there's a broken tablet, half-written. The scribe's hand frozen mid-stroke. The last line simply says, "The enemy is within the gates." And then, nothing. No reply. No record of who the enemy was. Just a final breath caught in clay. Elsewhere, we find shelves of tablets with the same chilling pattern, cut short mid-word, or with phrases scratched out violently. As if someone wanted the words to disappear, not just burn, be unmade. And in some cases, it worked. There are scripts we've found etched into stone that match no known language, entire systems of symbols that appear once and never again, like a voice that screamed once into the dark and was swallowed. It's not just sad. It's suspicious. Because writing systems don't just vanish, they evolve, they adapt. Unless someone makes sure they don't, unless someone decides that the past is too dangerous to be preserved. And here's where it gets even stranger. In a few rare places, writing continued, but changed. In Cyprus, for instance, an entirely new script appeared after the collapse. It borrowed nothing from its predecessors. It ignored the usual symbols. It started fresh. No reference to the old gods. No tribute to fallen kings. Just commerce. Tidy, simple, sanitized. Like someone wanted the act of writing stripped of memory, reduced to numbers and names and lists. No more myths, no more histories, just control. It's the same with early Phoenician writing. It emerged not as a song of culture, but as a ledger, clean, sharp, quietly powerful. The tools of a new kind of world, not ruled by priests or kings, but by traders, by those who needed no temples, only contracts. And if those traders survived the collapse, while everyone else fell, then maybe they knew something the kings didn't. Maybe they didn't just witness the end. Maybe they financed it. Because while temples burned and scripts disappeared, trade survived. Not everywhere, not openly, but underneath the surface. Black markets, hidden ports, goods changing hands without names or seals. A quiet current flowing beneath the ash. And those who controlled that current? They didn't need history. They needed silence. Because silence in the right hands is profitable. And that's what makes the collapse so strange. It wasn't total. It was selective, targeted, surgical. It destroyed memory, but preserved materials. It erased gods, but spared gold. It ended scripts, but allowed ships. The question is, who benefited, and who made sure the writing stayed dead? The tin that vanished. It's easy to forget that the Bronze Age ran on tin. Not gold, not silver, not grain, on tin. Without it, there was no bronze. And without bronze, there were no swords, no axes, no tools, no ships strong enough to cross the sea. Tin was the silent fuel behind every palace, every army, every empire. And then, like the cities themselves, it disappeared, vanished from the records, vanished from the roots, vanished from the earth. No explosion, no storm, no announcement carved into temple walls, just silence. Copper was everywhere. It flowed from Cyprus like blood through veins, but copper alone was too soft, too weak. It needed tin. And tin was rare. It came from faraway mountains and secret mines, Afghanistan, Anatolia, perhaps even from the misty shores of Britain. It passed through countless hands, each link in a chain of fragile trust. But during the collapse, that chain snapped. The tin trade vanished. Ships stopped coming. Mines went quiet. Tablets that once listed tin shipments by weight and port and patron, gone. And with it, bronze itself. Weapons grew dull. Tools broke. Kingdoms that had relied on bronze for power and prestige suddenly found themselves defenseless. And that collapse wasn't random. It was precise. Because cutting off tin doesn't just hurt a city. It paralyzes it. It weakens the soldiers. It slows the ships. It silences the scribes who etched with bronze styluses. It's like removing oxygen from a fire. You don't have to burn the palace, just take away the tin. And that's what someone did. The timing is too perfect to ignore. As the sea peoples moved across the seas, the tin stopped flowing. As cities fell, they fell in the order of their dependency, those with bronze armies collapsing first. Whoever orchestrated it understood something the kings had forgotten. Control the metal, and you control the world. There are theories of, course, that natural sources dried up, that wars disrupted trade, that the merchants simply scattered. But there are problems with those theories. For one, the tin didn't disappear forever. It came back, centuries later. New routes, new mines, new middlemen. And when it did, it came under different terms. No longer controlled by the great temples or crowned monarchs, it flowed through merchants, independent, private, quiet. Power had shifted. And maybe that was the point. Because what if the disappearance of tin wasn't an accident, but a strategy? A way to break the old world without raising a sword. A way to suffocate without a single siege. There's some evidence of stockpiling. Warehouses hidden deep inland, filled with unused tin ingots. Some never even opened. Some buried deliberately, marked with strange symbols not belonging to any known culture. Were these emergency caches, or something more calculated? Were they meant to survive the collapse, or were they meant to cause it? It's the kind of question that makes people nervous. Because if someone had the power to choke the world's supply of tin, they weren't just scavengers. They were engineers of collapse. They understood global dependency. They understood fragility. And most importantly, they understood timing. It's not just about cutting the supply. It's about cutting it when everyone needs it most. When armies are mobilizing. When alliances are teetering. When drought or famine already has the cities leaning too far over the edge. That's when you take away the tin and watch them fall. Not in battle, but in silence. Even today, we don't know where all the Bronze Age tin came from. Its full roots remain a mystery, a ghost trade. Some ingots carry isotopes linked to Central Asia. Others suggest origins as far as Iberia or Cornwall. But the paths they took, they're gone, erased, maps missing, names forgotten. Entire mining cultures vanished. It's almost as if someone wanted the sources untraceable. Because knowledge is power. And if you know where the tin comes from, you can follow it. If you follow it, you can control it. And if you control it, you can end an age. Not with fire, but with silence. The fires that knew where to burn. Every age has its sound. In the Bronze Age, it was the clink of bronze against bronze, the scratch of styluses across clay, the chant of priests echoing through temple corridors, the hiss of steam rising from ritual offerings. A world not quiet, never quiet, but orderly, predictable. And then came the fire. Not wild, not chaotic, but directed, almost intelligent. You can see it in the ruins. Blackened stonework only in key buildings, archives, granaries, armories. Residential quarters left mostly intact. Personal items spared, but libraries destroyed. This wasn't the fire of rage. It was the fire of intent. There's something cold about that. something methodical. Like someone made a list. What to erase, what to spare. And then struck one city at a time. Hattusa, Ugarit, Mycenae, Tiryns, Hazor. Not all of them were enemies. Not all of them were allies. But they all burned in the same pattern. Flames rising through the night. Walls cracking under heat. Scrolls curling into ash. And when the embers cooled, no names remained. But even fire leaves fingerprints. At several sites, we found signs of accelerants. Substances poured over archives and sealed doors. Not raider tools. Not common torches. Chemical compounds chosen for their ability to burn hot and fast. Too advanced for simple looters. Too focused for accident. And in many places the burn was downward. Fires lit from inside, from below. Meaning someone was already in the city. Someone who had keys. Someone who knew the layout. This wasn't an invasion from outside. It was sabotage from within. And when you start to see it that way, the collapse doesn't look like a series of unfortunate events. It looks like a campaign. Coordinated, deliberate, almost surgical. It's the way they destroyed statues too. Not smashed in frenzy, but defaced with purpose. Eyes gouged out, names chiseled, away. The ancient equivalent of wiping a hard drive. Because in the ancient world, names had power. If no one remembered your name, you ceased to exist. And the fire made sure of it. In Egypt, there was a name for this kind of erasure. Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Erase the records. Deface the statues. Bury the truth. But this wasn't Egypt's policy. This was bigger, wider. Like someone had taken the idea and scaled it to a whole continent. A civilizational memory wipe. And the evidence is everywhere, if you know where to look. In Knossos, a wall painting was found half burned. It showed a figure leading a procession, holding a scroll. But the figure's face had been scratched out, not by time, but by hand. At Ugarit, a kiln room was discovered with dozens of clay tablets waiting to be fired. The fire came, but not the kind they expected. The ceiling collapsed, crushing the wet tablets into fragments. Messages never sent. History never recorded. And in the ruins of Hazor, archaeologists found a shrine deliberately buried in rubble. Not destroyed, just hidden. Almost like someone wanted it to be found. Later. A whisper beneath the ash. Because not all the fire was erasure, some of it was defiance. There were those who tried to preserve what they could. A scroll hidden inside a jar. A figurine buried beneath a collapsed stair. A map scratched onto a cave wall, miles from any known settlement. These were not acts of survival. They were acts of resistance. Someone knew the fire was coming, and they tried to outlast it. Not with weapons, but with memory. Because memory is the one thing fire can't reach, if it's carried forward. And some did carry it. Across the seas. Across generations. In stories disguised as myths. In rituals stripped of names. In songs passed from mother to daughter, father to son. That's how memory survives a purge. It wears new clothes. It changes its name. It learns to whisper instead of sing. And it waits. Waits for someone to listen. And now, we are. We're piecing together what the fire tried to scatter. We're reading the charred fragments, scanning the scratched names, mapping the burn lines. And the more we see, the clearer it becomes. This was no accident. It was a pattern, a policy, a purge. Someone lit the fires. and someone else told them exactly where to burn. The ashes spoke a new language. After the collapse, the world didn't rebuild. Not really. It rearranged itself, smaller, rougher, hungrier. The great cities, those with walls that kissed the sky and priests who claimed to speak for gods, were mostly gone. In their place, villages, encampments, hilltop forts, not civilization, not yet, just survival. But something strange began to happen in those ashes. A new kind of voice emerged, not the grand epics of kings or the polished proclamations of scribes, but myths, fragments, dreams, the kind of stories told around fires, not written on clay. And if you listen closely, you'll hear something deeper in those stories, something hidden. Because myths often remember what history tries to forget. They speak in symbols when names are too dangerous. They exaggerate not to lie, but to protect the truth from being found too easily. And suddenly, all across the former Bronze Age world, those myths began to bloom. Stories of islands swallowed by the sea, of fire raining from the sky, of god-kings overthrown by tricksters, of great floods that washed away entire empires, of travelers arriving from the horizon with strange weapons and no past. They weren't just bedtime tales. They were memory, disguised. Take the Greek myths, for instance. They speak of a time before the known world, a golden age that ended in chaos, an age of heroes brought low by hubris, of gods who turned away. They never mention Hattusa or Ugarit or the Sea Peoples, but they don't need to, because their ruins still lay beneath the Aegean. And then there's the strange rise of new identities, the Israelites, the Philistines, the Phoenicians. Peoples whose roots seem to emerge from nowhere, suddenly present, already organized, already aware of the shattered world around them, as if they weren't born from the collapse, but stepped into it. The Philistines especially. G thought to be just one more tribe among many, but they were different. Their pottery, Aegean, their architecture, foreign, their burial customs, nothing like their neighbors. They arrived fully formed, with iron weapons, with strange gods, and they settled precisely where the fires had passed. What were they doing there? Why didn't they fall like the others? Unless they weren't fleeing the collapse. They were following it, tracing the burn line, claiming the silence. And in that silence, a new kind of world began to form. Not one bound by divine kings or legacy empires, but one ruled by trade, by mobility, by information passed mouth to mouth instead of carved into tablets. The new elite weren't priests or generals. They were merchants, shipbuilders, translators, people who could move between cultures, people who spoke many tongues, people who needed no homeland, just harbors. They didn't worship old gods. They didn't mourn the fallen temples, because they had their own. The gods of wind and coin and secrecy. The gods of networks. And this new order, it didn't rise like an empire. It spread like a shadow. Soft, silent, but everywhere. And as it did, the old stories faded. Not erased this time, just forgotten. Because forgetting can be easier than remembering, especially when remembering means pain. The survivors didn't build new cities in the image of the old. They built smaller ones, harder ones, tighter, with shorter memories. Children were born who had never seen a palace, never heard a hymn to the storm god, never felt the weight of bronze armor. To them, the stories of the old world were just that. Stories, not warnings, not history, just firelight talk. And so the memory faded, but not completely. Because even in silence, something stirred. A few voices still carried echoes of what came before, in tablets buried under floorboards, in symbols carved into stone too low to be noticed, in the broken rhythms of a lullaby no one quite understood. And now, centuries later, we're finding them, piecing them together, and they all say the same thing. Something happened, something unnatural, and the people who survived it didn't speak. Not because they couldn't, but because they were told not to. The cities that rose too fast, the world had ended, but not for everyone. While the great Bronze Age capitals lay buried beneath soot and stone, something else was beginning. Something quieter, smaller, but unsettlingly fast. New cities, new powers, new names, and they weren't starting from scratch. In the Levant, small settlements began to cluster near old trade roads, roads that officially no longer existed, roads that connected nothing, yet still showed signs of being used. In Phoenicia, narrow coastal strips bloomed into hubs of commerce. Ships returned to harbors where the empire fleets once anchored. But these new vessels flew no royal standard. They were leaner, faster, lighter, built for business, not battle. And their cargo? Tin dot, copper, ivory, glass, everything that had vanished. Now moving again, as if someone had just turned it back on. Too clean, too convenient, too soon. And then there was Byblos, a city that should have fallen like the rest. But it didn't. It remained. Scarred, yes, but intact. And from it came a new writing system. One stripped of curves and flourishes, simpler, faster, easier to learn. The alphabet. It spread like fire in dry grass. No scribal class required. No clay tablets. Just marks. Ink. Papyrus. Memory reduced to code. It was a revolution, but not a loud one, more like a quiet reset. And those who carried this alphabet? Traders. Merchants. People who moved between ruins as if they knew the terrain intimately. People who remembered just enough of the old world to profit from its bones. Coincidence or continuity? Because civilizations don't usually rise from collapse in straight lines. They splinter, they regress, they wander in confusion. But this felt rehearsed. Take the Philistines. They arrive with advanced knowledge of pottery, metalwork, and sea navigation. They settle precisely where strategic harbors lay open. And these Soas, or they carry no known script of their own, they adapt fast, borrowing letters, adopting weights, trading like they'd done it for generations. Where did they learn this? From whom? And when? Or consider the early Israelites. They emerge in the hill country. No palaces, no armies. But their oral traditions, later written, speak of exodus, collapse, wandering, war. Not just myth, maybe memory. Of a time when old orders fell and new tribes rose, not from nowhere, but from within. But even more curious are the gaps. The years where there's simply nothing. A blank line in history. No ruins, no records, no graves. It's like someone pressed pause, or worse, delete. And yet, when the world reappears, it's been rearranged. New gods, new systems, new rules. But beneath the surface, the fingerprints remain. Temple foundations built from older stones. Civic plans mirroring Hittite and Minoan geometry. Burial rituals that blend Egyptian, Aegean, and Anatolian styles, like someone mixing cultural ingredients left over from a destroyed feast. This wasn't invention. This was inheritance. Someone had the blueprint. And the rise of these new cities, Tyre, Sidon, Jerusalem, Ashkelon, they weren't just recoveries, they were replacements. And the people building them, they weren't starting over. They were picking up where something else left off, only quieter, only cleaner, only without the names. Because names are dangerous. They tie you to the past, to responsibility, to guilt. And maybe that's why the first few generations after the collapse were so silent. Maybe they weren't confused. Maybe they were complicit. And silence was the price of survival. You see it in the myth cycles, the way old gods are replaced, killed, merged, the way ancient battles are rewritten as moral epics. Not history, but therapy. Not memory, but justification. Because the truth of what happened might have been too much to bear, too much to pass down. So it wasn't passed. It was buried. Not under ash, but under stories. And the ones who rose from the collapse didn't just inherit the world, they inherited its secrets. Secrets they would build into the foundations of the new order. The hidden architects. There's a pattern buried in the silence. Not in what was destroyed, but in what was spared. Ports, trade routes, mine access points, grain corridors. The temples burned, the palaces fell, the languages died. But the infrastructure, it lingered. Scavenged, quietly maintained, passed from hand to hand like a whisper. And always, just beyond the reach of empire, were the ones who never seemed to fall. The merchants. They had no capitals, no crowns, no armies of their own. But their ships survived every fire. Their networks outlasted every king. They moved across borders before borders even had names. And after the collapse, they didn't mourn. They adapted. Because while the world above burned, they thrived in the cracks beneath it. At first, they were invisible. Moving goods between dead cities, salvaging bronze from battlefield corpses, trading secrets for spices, tin for silence. But then they became something more, organized, purposeful, as if someone was coordinating. Because when you look at who benefited most from the collapse, it wasn't the kings, it wasn't the priests, it wasn't even the conquerors. It was the middlemen, the brokers of things, the keepers of passage, the whisperers between cities. In Phoenicia, they built ships faster than anyone else, sleek, silent, designed to outrun questions. In Cyprus, they reopened copper mines while temples still smoldered in the east. In Crete, new settlements appeared on top of old ruins, carefully aligned but stripped of iconography. Function over faith. And through it all, goods flowed. Not in the open, not yet, but steadily, as if a plan was already in motion. And there's something else. Something harder to explain. At multiple post-collapse sites, coastal, inland, island-based, archaeologists have found identical weights, identical measures, identical merchant seals. Not just from one region, from many. As if someone had standardized commerce across a world that no longer officially existed. This wasn't chaos. It was transition, from the age of gods and kings to something quieter, something colder. Economies without nations, movement without allegiance, power without thrones. And in that shift, the survivors who understood trade, who understood movement, rose faster than those who clung to memory. Because in the ruins, memory was a liability, but flexibility, that was survival. It's here that we begin to sense the outline of something more, not a people, not a city, but a network. A shadow system that passed beneath the feet of fallen empires. You can't see it directly, but you can feel it. In the synchronized disappearance of scripts, in the clean, repeated fires, in the sudden emergence of new coinage systems with no known origin. Someone knew where to hit, someone knew when to strike, and something, was ready to replace what had been lost before the ash even cooled. Because this wasn't a fall, it was a handoff, from the ceremonial to the practical, from the divine to the transactional, from memory to profit. And once you see that pattern, it never stops showing up. You see it in later ages too, in Rome, in Byzantium, in every collapse where fire clears the stage, and someone steps through the smoke holding a ledger, not a sword. Always late to the scene, always ready, always unburned. The architects of silence don't wear crowns. They don't command armies. They don't leave statues behind. They leave systems, invisible ones. And if the Bronze Age ended in fire, it was only because fire was the fastest way to reset the game. The ghosts that built the Iron Age. When the Bronze Age died, the Iron Age didn't roar to life. It crept in. Quiet. Efficient. Almost as if it had been waiting. It didn't begin in temples or palaces, but in forges, in hidden valleys and mountain workshops, places far from the old centers of power, places no army bothered to burn. Because what came next didn't need bronze. It needed something harder, iron, darker, more permanent. It wasn't as glamorous. It didn't shine. It rusted. It scarred. It whispered instead of dazzled. But it lasted. And the men who wielded it didn't care for ceremony. They weren't priests. They weren't kings. They were survivors, blacksmiths, raiders, engineers of the new. The first swords of iron weren't royal gifts. They were practical things, tools of war in a world with no rules. But someone was supplying the ore. Someone was moving knowledge where the temples had failed. Because working iron wasn't easy. It required heat, control, technique. This wasn't rediscovery. It was redirection. Knowledge that had once belonged to the elite, now in the hands of those who obeyed no lineage, no gods, only need. And with that shift, something else began to rise. Not just weapons, but systems. You see it in the cities. They weren't built like the old ones. No wide temple courtyards, no high ceremonial roads. These new cities were tight, gridded, defensive, designed not for worship, but for survival. And who built them? Not always the descendants of the fallen kingdoms, but others, outsiders, Philistines in the west, Arameans in the east, sea peoples along the coastlines. Names that had no place in the Bronze Age because they didn't exist there. Or if they did, they weren't named yet. But now they rose fast, with knowledge that shouldn't have survived. Techniques that once took centuries to develop, appearing almost overnight. Coincidence? Or continuity? It's as if someone had packed the tools of civilization into a crate before the fire, then opened it again when the smoke cleared. Iron smelting, maritime navigation, alphabetic writing, organized urban planning, not rediscovered. Relocated, redistributed. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the ones who benefited from this rebirth weren't necessarily the innocent. They didn't mourn the Bronze Age. They capitalized on its absence. They didn't light temples. They lit forges. They didn't pray. They traded. And in this new age, value wasn't measured in divine favor. It was measured in iron. Who controlled it? Who shaped it? Who sold it? And suddenly, those who had once whispered in the shadows, the traders, the metallurgists, the shipwrights, were no longer beneath the kings. They were the kings, or something better, uncrowned, unchallenged, unrecorded. Because in a world built on fire and forgetting, memory became optional. Power no longer needed statues or songs. It just needed leverage. And iron gave it. We think of the Iron Age as an evolutionary leap, a technological inevitability. But what if it wasn't a leap? What if it was a pivot? What if iron wasn't the next step? What if it was the plan all along? Bronze kept power centralized, sacred, coded in ritual. Iron democratized it, and that terrified the old world. Because once iron spread, there was no going back. Anyone could have a blade. Anyone could defend themselves. Anyone could become dangerous. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the ones who survived the collapse didn't just want to rebuild. Maybe they wanted to redesign a world without kings, without priests, without memory, just iron, roads, coins, and control. The Iron Age didn't rise from the ruins of the Bronze Age. It rose from its ashes like a shadow in new clothes. The myths that refuse to die. Fire can erase a city. It can crack stone, melt bronze, silence voices. But it can't destroy a story, if the story chooses to live. After the collapse, myths began to rise like smoke from the rubble. Different lands, different tongues, but they all carried the same scent. Loss, displacement, fury. A flood that wipes the slate clean. A god who punishes with fire. A people who wander. A war that ends the age of heroes. To a child, they were bedtime stories. To the survivors, they were warnings. But warnings disguised in poetry, in riddles, in rhyme. Because the truth had become too dangerous to tell plainly. Take the tale of Atlantis, a utopia lost beneath the waves, its power and pride punished by the gods. We treat it like fiction, a philosopher's parable. But in the wake of the Bronze Age collapse, the echoes are unmistakable. A proud, sea-based civilization, suddenly destroyed, its memory scattered. Coincidence? Or memory in disguise? Then there's the Greek story of the Titanomachy, the war between gods and older gods, a celestial coup, an old order violently overthrown. Just a myth? Or a buried record of regime change? A way to explain without explaining why the temples no longer sang, why the gods changed names, why the old rituals were replaced. It wasn't just Greece. In the Hebrew tradition, we hear of a world turned to chaos, of cities like Sodom and Gomorrah consumed by divine wrath, of towers brought down for daring to reach the sky. Collapse stories, purging stories. The language of trauma wrapped in theology, and always just beneath the surface, you'll find a fracture. A before and an after. Before the flood, before the fire, before the gods left. It's the same in Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, a flood erases humanity, and the survivors must rebuild under new rules. And in Egypt, myths begin to shift. Osiris, once a god, of kingship, becomes the god of the dead. A nation, perhaps, grieving a world it could no longer protect. These weren't inventions. They were codes, encrypted memory. Because in a world where writing had vanished and names were dangerous, myth became the safest vault. A story could cross borders. It could outlive kings. It could pass from lips to ears for centuries, changing slightly, yes, but keeping its core intact. And some myths did more than remember. They warned. They spoke of repeating patterns. Civilizations that rise too high, knowledge that angers the heavens, languages that unite men so powerfully The gods must strike them down. Stories told to children, but aimed at the architects, those who might try again. Because collapse isn't always the end. Sometimes it's the blueprint. The myths that survive a purge don't just preserve the past, they shape the future. They set the rules for what not to do. They whisper, don't build too high. Don't trust the sea. Don't forget the fire. But there's something else, something more recent. The places where these myths emerged, Greece, Egypt, Canaan, they didn't just survive, they restructured. They built new gods on old thrones, Zeus over the sky gods, Yahweh over the storm gods, Isis over the mother goddesses, and the old names erased, folded into myth, rebranded. As if someone didn't just want the old world buried, they wanted it rewritten, reshaped, made manageable. The past not as it was, but as it needed to be, controlled. And the myths we read today, they are not just stories, they are fingerprints. Clues left by those who saw the fire and chose to speak through symbols instead of screams. Because fire can silence a city, but not a story. Not if you know how to tell it right. The patterns. Beneath the stones, you can burn a scroll. You can smash a statue. But foundations are harder to erase, especially if they weren't meant to be seen, only built upon. All across the ancient world, beneath the newer cities, beneath the rebuilt temples and markets, we find them. Stones that don't match the rest. Angles too perfect. Materials too refined for the time they're dated to. Walls built without mortar, just gravity and precision. Aligned not with nearby roads or rivers, but with stars. Always the same stars, as if someone remembered or refused to forget. Because even after the collapse, the builders came back. Different names, different languages. But they built on the same footprints. Why? Maybe because those sites held power. Geographic, spiritual, strategic. Or maybe because they didn't know why, only that something important had once stood there. And someone told them, build here. Take the city of Troy. Layer upon layer, civilization atop civilization, each one built over the ashes of the last. But at the very bottom, beneath even the Bronze Age ruins, lies a set of stones, impossibly old, impossibly shaped, too advanced for their time. As if the Bronze Age itself was built on a memory, a copy of something older, something lost. Or take the ruins of Ugarit. Beneath the burned palaces are tunnels, narrow, precise, unmapped, their purpose unknown. Some say they were drainage. Some say escape routes. But they're too deliberate, too complex. Built before the city grew above them. And then there's Hattusa, capital of the Hittites. The city burned, the archives destroyed. But the foundations remain. And scattered through those foundations, stones aligned with solstices, chambers that echo in strange frequencies, not religious, not functional, just there, as if placed for something no longer remembered. This is the pattern. The visible world collapses. But the invisible world, the codes in stone, remains. And across those ruins, you find strange consistency, temples that face the same direction, altars placed at mathematically significant points, cities shaped like constellations. Why? Who were they signaling, or honoring, or hiding from? Because someone kept building the same patterns, even after everything else had changed. And they weren't just copying. They were continuing. Like a ritual passed down without explanation. Build this way. Place this here. Don't ask why. Some of these sites share features with no clear connection between cultures. A glyph here in Anatolia, identical to one found in Crete. A ceremonial layout in Cyprus, matching one buried under Tel Kabri, too far apart, too different. Unless there was something, or someone, connecting them. A memory older than language. A network buried deeper than roads. And then there's the strangest thing. The sites that were untouched. Villages that should have been raided. Temples that should have burned, but didn't. Why? Because someone knew not to touch them, or because someone knew who they belonged to. And it wasn't the kings. Not anymore. It was the ones beneath, the ones behind, the ones who survived, not by building high, but by building deep. Because a city above ground is a statement. But a city below, that's a secret. And if you know how to read the stones, how to measure their angles, trace their shadows, you begin to hear the voice that fire couldn't silence. The past wasn't lost. It was hidden, layered beneath rubble, encoded in walls, waiting for someone to look down instead of forward. The exiles who remembered. Not everyone died in the collapse. Some simply vanished. They left no monuments, no chronicles, no declarations etched in stone. But they moved, across mountains, through forests, along ancient roads worn smooth by generations of footsteps. And with them, they carried something heavier than bronze. Memory. They weren't kings. They weren't warriors. They were potters, fishermen, midwives, children. The ones who had seen the palaces burn from a distance. The ones who had watched the priests fall silent. The ones who had nothing left but memory, tightly packed like clay in their chests. And they moved. They became wanderers. Sometimes welcomed, sometimes feared. Sometimes absorbed into other cultures. Other times pushed to the edges, into hills, into deserts, into silence. We don't know their names, but we know their patterns, because wherever they went, they left faint echoes. A weaving style that didn't belong. A burial custom that clashed with local belief. A lullaby sung in a dialect no one remembered teaching. These were the quiet rebels of the collapse. They didn't resist with swords. They resisted with stories. Stories they didn't always tell outright. Because in the world after the fires, memory could be dangerous. So they buried it. In symbols. In customs. In the way bread was baked, or how certain stars were avoided during planting season. Memory became ritual. Ritual became culture. Culture became myth. And the truth? It dissolved into all three. You can see traces of them in the highlands of Anatolia, where strange megaliths appear far from trade routes. You find them in the hills of Canaan, where new settlements appear suddenly, tight-knit, isolated, yet already adapted to survival. You hear whispers of them in the earliest books of the Old Testament. Tales of wandering, of betrayal, of sudden destruction and flight. Tales that feel like allegory, but read like encoded history. And then there's the strange uniformity of certain taboos that emerged after the collapse. No idols, no grand images of gods, no towering ziggurats or ornate shrines. A quiet rejection of everything the old world had worshipped. Was it divine command or trauma? A reaction to what the temples had failed to stop? The exiles didn't just lose their cities, they lost faith. And in the absence of temples, they built memory. Carefully, cautiously, because they had seen what happened when the wrong knowledge reached the wrong ears. So they passed it carefully. Father to son, mother to daughter, not carved in stone, but in glances, in pauses, in the spaces between words, And centuries later, when their descendants finally did write things down, they didn't begin with conquest. They began with exodus, with leaving, with silence. The gods were still there, but distant. The world was still turning, but broken. Because something had happened, something too large to name directly. So they named it in stories. A serpent cast down, a tower undone, a garden lost. Each one a thread pulled from the same cloak of ash. Because even when fire wins, there are always those who escape, who carry something forward. Not to reclaim the past, but to warn the future. And maybe that's what these exiles were doing all along. Not trying to survive, but trying to remember. The right way, the safe way. The kind of remembering that hides inside you until the world is ready to listen again. The collapse wasn't the end. It was the test. For centuries, the collapse of the Bronze Age was treated like a mystery. A freak storm of war, drought, famine, migration. A perfect storm. But perfect storms don't come this clean, this quiet, this precise, this repeatable. Because once you've followed the ruins, listened to the myths, read the scorched tablets, and walked the foundations of cities no one should have rebuilt so quickly, a new idea begins to surface. What if the collapse wasn't the end? What if it was the beginning? A prototype. A test. Because buried in the ashes of the Bronze Age is a pattern so eerily modern, it stops feeling ancient at all. Supply chains stretched too far. Elites disconnected from the land. Military alliances too complicated to manage. Blind faith in trade and diplomacy to hold a fragile peace together. And beneath it all, a shadow network quietly collecting power. That's not ancient. That's familiar. That's now. And maybe that's the point. The Bronze Age didn't fall because of gods or fate. It fell because someone learned how to make a world collapse and how to build a new one out of the debris. And once you learn that, you don't forget. You replicate. The strategy wasn't fire. It was disruption. Disrupt the narrative. Disrupt the memory. Disrupt the flow of goods, ideas, trust. Break the bonds that hold people together. Then offer a new order. Simpler, cleaner, more profitable. You don't burn every city. You burn just enough to make people grateful for whoever comes next. You don't erase history. You rewrite it. The temples didn't fall for nothing. They fell to clear the stage. And when the curtain lifted again, the script had changed. The world had been edited. And the editors, they never left their names. But they left patterns. We see them in the sudden rise of alphabets designed for speed, in new economic systems that no longer need it kings to function, in the way myth replaced memory and memory was privatized. The same technologies that once belonged to priesthoods and palaces now belong to merchant guilds and private actors. And the most dangerous part? People welcomed it. They didn't mourn the loss of the old world. They adapted. They celebrated efficiency, speed, mobility, control. Even today, we're taught to believe the Bronze Age collapse was natural, a tragedy, an accident. But is it an accident if it benefits someone? Is it a tragedy if the new system runs better for those at the top? And what does it mean that after the collapse, no single culture dominated? Instead, networks did. Unseen hands. Movers without borders. The middlemen became monarchs. The whisperers became architects. And that's when it hits you. We never rebuilt the old world. We built the world they wanted. And we've been living in its shadow ever since. Because a civilization doesn't just collapse once. It collapses in cycles. And each time, the memory gets shorter. Each time, the story gets simpler. Each time, it becomes easier to forget that this has happened before, and harder to see when it's happening again. That's what makes the Bronze Age collapse so terrifying. Not that it ended an era, but that it might have started ours. The collapse was always about us. Some stories end in fire, others in silence. But this one, it ends in a mirror. Because as we sift through the ash of the Bronze Age, we're not just uncovering their world, we're seeing the outline of our own. It's not the swords or the ships or the crumbled walls that feel familiar. It's the structure. A global system, stretched to its limits. Interconnected but fragile. Ruled by trade more than armies. Built on invisible agreements. Overconfident in its permanence. Sound familiar? The world of 1200 BC wasn't primitive. It was advanced. Just advanced in a different language. And when it fell, it didn't fall randomly. It was peeled apart. Intentionally. Strategically. Silently. A few cities at a time. A few voices at a time. Until the entire world went quiet. That silence lasted 100 years. No records, no writing, no explanation, only absence. And now we're left wondering, are we next? Because collapse doesn't always look like fire in the streets. Sometimes it looks like systems grinding to a halt, like institutions losing trust, like stories being rewritten before your eyes, like a memory being buried while you're still living it. We think of ancient collapse as something distant, safe. But what if it was a blueprint? What if they learned back then what works? How to reset a world without ever claiming responsibility? Burn a few key nodes, rewrite the map, offer something cleaner in its place. And if people forget fast enough, history resets itself, and the cycle begins again. There are signs, whispers, patterns repeating, networks growing more powerful than nations, memory outsourced to machines, stories shortened, context erased, the same fault lines cracking in new places, the same smiles hiding sharpened teeth. But maybe that's why we look back at all, not to mourn the past, but to warn the future, because history only vanished is when we stop tracing the smoke, only stays buried when we stop asking who lit the fire. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't natural, it wasn't sudden, and it wasn't forgotten. It was covered up. And now, it's uncovering us. The ruins are speaking again, the myths are waking up, and the story is far from over. Not because it's ancient, but because it's alive, still burning, quietly, waiting for someone to listen.